Please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Questions here are, will this escalate into a full-blown trade war, or are we in the middle of one already? And more importantly, is India really prepared to tackle if such a situation really arises? To take this discussion forward, we are now joined by Shereen Bhan.
Well, thanks very much, guys. Yes, we're now joined by Jayant, Dasgupta, the former Indian ambassador to the WTO, and political and economic affairs commentator Einar Tangen. We'll also be joined by Jim O'Neill, the former chairman of Goldman Sachs Asset Management, in just a bit. But Mr. Dasgupta, you know, there's two camps. One camp that believes that President Trump's bark has been worse than his bite. There's another camp led by people like Raghuram Rajan who are genuinely concerned and believe that we shouldn't take the actions that the Trump administration has taken lightly. Which camp do you belong to?
I think it would be very difficult to, belong to one camp or the other. But I would subscribe to the notion that whatever President Trump has been announcing in the recent past, especially in relation to the escalation of tariffs on steel and aluminium, I don't think it has been followed through to the last word, because President Trump just yesterday, I think, has exempted 7 countries, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, yes, Brazil, Argentina, Australia, South Korea. So that takes about 67% of the US imports of steel. So effectively, only 1/3 of the US's steel imports are going to be subject to tariffs from midnight today, US time. So I think the announcement which was made right at the beginning, and then the soft pedaling a little bit, that shows that President Trump probably will bow to reason and wiser counsel from his advisors, and he will not take it to the ultimate point.
Well, except that his advisors keep changing every single day. Today we've seen the National Security Advisor change, but let me go across to Einar. We've seen China say that, look, we're going to retaliate. $3 billion worth of tariffs is what China is looking at this point in time. But given the fact that, as Mr. Dasgupta pointed out, we saw the Trump administration now providing those exemptions to a lot of the allies, do you believe that this is, in a sense, the US's way of getting China to make some compromises, and you believe that this is going to reconcile at some sort of middle ground?
Well, it's hard to tell the future, but I think you have to keep some other things in mind. First off, when Trump announced the steel and aluminum tariffs, understand that China is the 4th largest exporter of aluminum and isn't even in the top 8 of steel directly to the United States. So it would seem kind of odd that he was shooting his friends first in an effort to target China. But he loved the idea and the result. When he announced that, it changed the conversation in Washington away from a lot of the troubles he's currently facing. And it did something else which really boosted his ego, which is all of a sudden all of these trade groups, all of these countries, leaders, everybody was calling Donald Trump. And this is something that very much appeals to him. He likes to be the man in charge. He likes to be the person who's calling the shots. And he's very amenable. When you approach him on a one-on-one basis, he says, oh, what can we do? He's a deal maker, and he senses that. But he wants something in return. He says, well, you owe me one, this kind of stuff. So the other part of this is that this really, he needs to get away from this conversation that's going on. And, he has 3 women who are accusing him of sexual things, and 2 of them say that they slept with him, had unprotected sex. I mean, it goes on. It's a tabloid version. Then you have Robert Mueller on the other side, who's closing in, saying that he wants to interview Donald Trump. He's sent him a list of questions. There's the turmoil in the White House itself. So in terms of China, China is only responding with the $3 billion to this first foray. That's the steel and aluminum tariffs that were things. We have not seen what they're going to do with the $6 million. We have 15 days to figure out what the U.S. is actually going to do, but I can almost guarantee you that China will respond leg for leg on this particular one because they can't afford not to. They don't want to be seen as weak, as accommodating Donald Trump. They're more than willing to sit down, but if he wants to start a trade war, it's going to get bloody.
Do you believe that the WTO is relevant at all in the manner in which the Trump administration intends to go about trade?
Well, this is the big question that everybody's wondering about, and this is something that affects India in terms of how they're going. What is the world going to be like without the WTO? I mean, India and China and many other countries, ASEAN, have been experiencing very wide growth. There's a massive move of GDP. 2001, the world GDP is $50 trillion. You go forward 15 years, it's expanded to $112 trillion. And most of that growth did not come for Europe and America. The largest growth was for all the rest, not just China. So the WTO was very, very beneficial. If the United States has, and it seems that it's decided that the WTO was unfair, just like NAFTA is unfair, the UN is unfair, climate change is unfair, anything that is not solely dominated by the U.S. is unfair, then you have a real problem. And this is not just going to be China's problem. It's going to be everyone. It's because Europe still adheres to the WTO. They believe that trade is good. The only one who's really saying that they don't like this, they want to take their ball and go home, is the United States. The question is, will the rest of the world suddenly say, look, there's a rising China that's, 15% of GDP that's growing at 6.5 to 7% a year. You have India that's growing. These are the big markets. Why do we need the U.S.? And this is the real danger for the U.S., that it becomes marginalized by its own actions, by radicalizing this thing. Already, Trump has proven himself to be a very unreliable partner. That's according to his closest allies. So it's very hard to see. In diplomacy and business, reliability is key. You cannot plan if you don't know what the other person's going to do, and you can't predict it. And this is one of the issues with Trump.
Yeah. Well, that certainly is one of the issues with the Trump administration. Jim O'Neill joining us as well. Jim, one, of course, is the fact that, a tweet a day changes the perspective that the United States has and the Trump administration has on many issues, including trade. But I want to ask you now, given what we have seen them announce when it comes to measures against China, and Wilbur Ross telling CNBC that this is only the first set of steps and more action will follow if China were not to comply with what the U.S. is looking for, which could include things like production cuts, etc. What do you foresee, Jim, from here on?
Well, to be quite honest, I'm not sure. As we see virtually every week, trying to figure out what this US president is going to do about virtually anything is close to impossible. Quite where he's getting his economic advice from, I have no idea. It's kind of crazy. A lot of the issues that they try, and it's almost definitely for some domestic social media audience rather than to have a sort of economic impact and genuinely thinking about the health of the future of the US economy, because the kind of issues that they focus on are about 20 years out of date. I mean, we live in a world where the most highly valued American company, Apple, sells more iPhones to Chinese consumers than US consumers. This is a sort of ridiculous thing for the United States to do, in my view. Doesn't make any sense.
Let's assume that he intends to follow through with what has been announced. So far, and we don't know whether we'll see a tweet tonight or maybe over the next few hours, but let's assume that he goes through with what has been announced so far, which is $60 billion that the US is announcing and $3 billion which is what China intends to retaliate with. What impact is that likely to have as a first step?
So I think I just heard the end of the previous guest you was chatting to. I sort of agree. The underlying issue is the bigger one. I think is the initial impact. It's not going to be much. Part of why I said this is 20 years out of date China's overall current account surplus is about 1/8 of the size it was 10 years ago. It's less than 2% of GDP. And their exports to the United States are much smaller as a percentage of GDP than they were 10 years ago. And linked to your own country, India, where we are slowly moving to a world where the United States doesn't dominate the world economy or world trade. So this is essentially almost shooting themselves in their own foot. It's sort of, it's crazy. I just don't get. 30 years ago, maybe, but today it's just a sort of gimmick that isn't very sensible, but obviously upsets the financial markets because who knows where it will stop. And I am assuming that you won't have other more rational countries trying to do the same thing between China and themselves, because that would be of much greater concern. But in some ways, this is essentially isolating the US, as we see on issues to do with climate change and no doubt some other issues too. It's kind of crazy.
So it's kind of crazy, but for now, at least on the back of what we've heard from both the US and China, the impact is likely to be limited. And I'm caveating that for now because we don't know what's going to happen next. But, I want to, Jim, talk to you about one of the other issues. And we've just got another tweet from President Trump saying that he may, in fact, veto the spending bill. So, what's your outlook now as far as global growth is concerned? Because that's been moving along quite nicely. It's been looking strong. Momentum has been picking up. How concerned would you be about whether it's these, trade skirmishes that could escalate into a full-blown war, or other global issues that could impede the growth that we're seeing currently?
Well, to be honest, I feel a bit less sure than I have done for some time. Last time I spoke to you, I was very much part of this camp that I have been for many, many months, that all the indicators I'm used to looking at have been and remained very strong, suggesting we certainly came into 2018 with world GDP growth well above 4%. But you've got three things in the past week all going on at the same time. You have this crazy protectionist populist stance against China in the US. Of course, we have signs from the Federal Reserve Board that if growth weren't to slow anyhow, they're going to be raising interest rates slightly faster than before over the next 2 years. And then thirdly, and the thing that's perhaps of most concern, which is not getting any headlines, is actually the European economic data this week has been slightly disappointing for the first time in many, many months. So maybe we shouldn't dismiss that some of the momentum that has driven the world economy so much the past year is slowing a little. I quickly add that the Chinese data we've had has been surprisingly strong. So I wouldn't want to get carried away, but I think there is some evidence that world momentum has slowed, even without this craziness in Washington.
Well, Jim ONeill, Jayant Dasgupta and Einar, we'll have to leave it there. Appreciate you joining us here to discuss the implications of the action that Donald Trump has decided to take against China and what that could mean potentially for the global economy and whether we are in fact in the midst of a trade war.